Welcome, everyone. Good day, and welcome to the Chesapeake Foodshed Network's Coffee Talk series, Learning and Connecting for Action. My name is Yona Sipos, and I direct the program development of the Chesapeake Foodshed Network through Local Concepts, LLC, a consulting firm providing the development and backbone support for the CFN. I'm joined today by Christy Gabbard, who's the owner of Local Concepts and the network coordinator of the CFN. Before jumping into the coffee talk, I'll provide a very brief overview of the CFN. The Chesapeake Foodshed Network is a group of organizations, businesses, funders, agencies, and other change agents working across the Chesapeake watershed to build a stronger and more resilient food system. We're a relatively new initiative, about 2 years in the making, and the leadership group that spurred the network's development did so because they recognized that a great deal of extraordinary work was being done to advance our regional food system, but there was no entity intentionally trying to build those connections and the trust and the relationships among those out there doing the work. The mission of the CFN, therefore, is to catalyze connections and collaborations that help build a sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and equitable regional food system in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We believe that by catalyzing connections and collaborations, we are stronger together such that we can help to accelerate change in our food system. We encourage conversation and connection in various ways, including social media. Please note the usernames and hashtags on the slide footers. We would love to see your tweets. So next we have a picture of our network building blocks. The foundation of our network is all about building connections, getting to know one another, sharing information and knowledge, building relationships and trust with the thought that as we know one another better, we might over time see opportunities for alignment and to work collectively toward action. We invite anyone who supports our vision of a sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and equitable regional food system to participate in the Chesapeake Foodshed Network. So what are our coffee talks? These are programs funded by the Town Creek Foundation and the Prince Charitable Trusts that provide a platform for our network to catalyze connections around specific food system topics. We partner with resource experts who provide a quick learning opportunity through their webinar presentation. And then during the webinar and in the follow-up materials, we identify ways for people to continue to engage and dig in deeper around that topic. Today's coffee talk is an opportunity for all of us to learn more about the challenges and opportunities with repurposing food and reducing risk. The legal and practical dimensions of putting excess food to its highest and best use. And just a note here that this coffee talk has been organized by the Chesapeake Foodshed Network Food Waste and Recovery Work Group, and we'll have a chance to share more detail about that at the end of the presentation. Just before we get into, I share the bio for Nicole, I'll just let you know a couple of other technical logistical pieces. This is the first time that we're using Zoom webinar system, so please forgive any fumbling or any mistakes that we might make with this new technology. Thank you for your patience around that. Just so you know, you should have the option while you're looking at the presentation to pull up the chat icon and have a chance to chat with the audience and with the presenters. There's also an option for you to submit questions through the Q&A tab. And Christy, I think, is adding some of this information into the chat feature. And she's explaining also how the Q&A feature can be found by hovering over the bottom of the Zoom window. All the questions will be collected by Christy and shared with Nicole after her presentation, and we'll have a chance for the Q&A. So without further ado, I will introduce Nicole Civita, who we're absolutely delighted to have as our resource expert for today. Nicole is with the Food Recovery Project and the University of Arkansas's School of Law's LLM program in Agricultural and Food Law. She's also an affiliated professor with that program. The Food Recovery Project educates stakeholders on the legal dimensions of food recovery and proposes strategic policy reforms. Nicole is also the Assistant Director of the Ryan Freed Center for Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems and faculty in Sustainable Food Systems at Sterling College. Using a multidisciplinary approach that bridges legal expertise with hands in the soil agricultural practice, Nicole's academic work focuses on developing full-scope policy solutions to the challenges facing our food system. She inspires her students to create the food future they wish to see by doing the same. Nicole is a frequent speaker on the subjects of food conservation, food justice, community food security, planning for place-based food, and the power and limits of a market-based food movement. She holds an LLM in agricultural and food law from the University of Arkansas School of Law, a JD from Georgetown University Law Center, and an AB from Columbia University. We are so pleased to have Nicole with us today. And Nicole, I'm going to stop the share of my screen so that you can bring up your presentation, and we'll have you take it away. Thank you so much. Look forward to your presentation and everyone's questions after the program.
I have put together a very dense set of slides. We're not going to get through all of them, but I'm making the slides available to all the attendees after the webinar. So my hope was to put in lots of additional information that you might be able to draw upon and use later on. As Yona said, I wear a number of hats, all related to food law and policy, food systems work, food justice, and I am affiliated with 2 different academic programs where I split my time. The work I do allows me to take a very different kind of approach to food law. I spent many years practicing law in a big international law firm, but these days I look much more at the community-based and applied dimensions, as well as legal education and policy shifts. So it's really, it's my privilege to get to work on food waste issues because they can be such powerful consensus builders. As I'm sure many of you already know, based on your affiliations and your interest in this topic, we are wasting far, far too much food in America and across the globe. The statistics on that are repeated so often that I'm actually not going to take our time together today to go over them, but have shared a number of resources for further investigation that set that stage for anyone who is new to the topic. But after several years of doing this, I'm finding that this is now an issue folks know a fair amount about at the baseline level, and they're ready to dive in and figure out how to do something about the problem. So with 40% of our food wasted in the US every year at the retail and consumer level, $165 billion of economic harm, and just untold environmental consequences that we're just beginning to understand in terms of the embedded resources that we're wasting and the methane that we're releasing, the warming that we are doing with that problem. I'm going to gloss over the problem, hope you're with me on that, and move into what we do to put excess food to its highest and best use. As Yona mentioned, I'm here wearing my Food Recovery Project hat today. We started the Food Recovery Project several years ago when we realized that many people who worked in the food system and had access to lots of excess wholesome food thought not only that it might be risky to do something with it, but they thought it was flat out illegal to donate it. And we knew better. So we decided to focus on just getting the information out there about the legal environment around excess food and what can be done with it, focusing primarily at that point on food recovery, the repurposing of wholesome, edible excess food for donative human use. Sometimes I regret the name of the project because as I've dove into the work so much more, I've come to really prefer the term food conservation, and thinking about how we put food to its highest and best use, which is often and almost always feeding humans, but then looking at the rest of it from a systems-based approach and figuring out what we can do to capture all of the value in that food. Today, though, I'm going to focus most of my thoughts around food recovery. And with all this food we're wasting, with 48 million Americans who are food insecure, and this idea that we could meet the full caloric needs of those 48 million Americans by repurposing just 30% of the excess food that goes to waste. And I offer that not because I think that's the solution to food insecurity in the US. Let me be really clear about that. You hear that often by advocates in this space. Very few of us think it's just as simple as taking the extra food and putting it towards the right people. Hunger in America is more of a distributive problem than a supply problem, but I offer that just to show the magnitude. Obviously, there are structural inequities and much more complex systems problems we would need to solve to durably address hunger inequality and really build food just solutions. But we have all this excess, we have people who need it, and we certainly have a food system that needs to get those nutrients back into it. So what are the barriers? Like I said, the first one is this expectation of illegality. We used to walk into grocery stores and hear produce managers tell us it was illegal, it was against the law to give away the food that they didn't sell, even if it wasn't going to be for human use, if it was just going to be for composting or feeding wildlife, let alone livestock. That's untrue everywhere. It is never illegal to give away the food. It may be against company policy in some places, and there's an opportunity to change policy, but it is not illegal. There's this other sense that there's a lot of risk around it, and there's some good reason to feel a little trepidatious about this, and then there's this sort of just outsized specter of risk. What do we worry about when we're dealing with excess food? Certainly, food businesses worry about foodborne illness. They worry about it all of the time. And that is in large part because the legal standard for foodborne injury is really, really, really tough. When you sell food, when you put food into the stream of commerce, you can be held strictly liable. That means liability even in the absence of negligence if you make or sell defective food products that cause an injury. And that kind of liability attaches if the product was defective, if it was used as it was intended, so you ate it, and the defect caused the injury. We don't get into a question of, were you at fault? Did you do anything wrong? The level of care of the food we eat. And that liability in many states attaches to all entities in the chain of distribution, even those who unsuspectingly receive the product in a tainted form. So this is a strong, strong disincentive to putting less than pristine food into the stream of consumption, especially when you don't have that countervailing promise of profit, right? The risk is then maybe not worth the benefit. So there's this sense of fear about foodborne illness, and even when you feel really confident in the food, it's not just that you're worried about the legal liability possibilities, or even if you know kind of what I'm about to tell you next in terms of the liability protections, businesses may be worried about the negative attention that could come back on them if they were just involved in a foodborne illness case. And then finally, there's this sense of like the path of least resistance. We all know it's far easier to just dump something than it is to do the right thing with it. It doesn't mean it's hard to do the right thing, but it does mean it takes an element of planning and training and oversight to develop a good food recovery program, to make sure your staff and volunteers know how to carry it out and that they are in fact carrying it out. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So given these dynamics, way back when, as early as I believe about 1974, 77, the individual states started to pass laws to create liability protections, buffers against liability when businesses donated food, so that this waste problem wouldn't happen and the incentive would be there to donate. Until 1990, there was like a 50-state free-for-all. Every state had its own mini Good Samaritan Act, its own way of dealing with it. The standards were different across state lines. And in a food system that is largely nationalized and globalized, that was really difficult to cope with. And it basically acted just as that disincentive to do anything because figuring it out was too hard. Congress tried to fix it between 1990 and 96 by putting a model act out there, something that like states could use as their standard, but were not required to use, hoping that everyone would get on board and come together and row in the same direction. Didn't happen. But in 1996, which doesn't feel like it should be 20 years ago, but was, the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act was passed. And that act exempts those who make good faith donations of food and grocery products to nonprofit organizations that feed the hungry. It exempts them from most common types of liability for injuries arising from the consumption of the donated food. Folks often ask me, who was Bill Emerson? Why is this called that? And very quickly, he was a Missouri representative in the House who really was a hunger fighter. He tried to get bipartisan support for anti-hunger initiatives, co-sponsored the legislation, unfortunately died of lung cancer while it was pending, and it was named after him in his honor. So how does this work? The Bill Emerson Act creates a powerful exemption from liability for that strict liability for strictly or negligently caused harm arising from the nature, age, packaging, or condition of donated items. But to stay within the bounds of this, there's 4 standards. The item that is donated has to either be an apparently wholesome food or an apparently fit grocery product. And we'll talk about what those are. The covered party, which is delineated in the statute, needs to donate the items in good faith. So you can't like donate it trying to make someone sick. That's a very easy standard to meet, unless you're a real evildoer. And the donation has to be made to a nonprofit organization, but we'll come back to that in a moment too, because there's a kind of funny little wrinkle with the use of that term. And then the nonprofit has to distribute the donated items to needy individuals. So, digging a little deeper here, apparently wholesome and fit products are those that meet all the quality and labeling standards imposed by state, federal, and local laws and regulations, even though you don't have a ready market for them. And that piece of it, we'll come back to this in a minute, is actually what makes it a little bit difficult to work with the law as written. It's doable, but that's kind of a tack on at the end of the process of writing this legislation that maybe undermines its purposes a little bit. But basically, if this is food you would have sold, but you couldn't sell because there wasn't someone there to buy it or wasn't someone there to buy it in time, it's excess. The chances are you're probably going to be able to donate it and be protected. And then it also covers donations of related grocery products, which can be very helpful for food banks and charitable organizations that do emergency feeding to also be able to collect those and give them to their clients. Who does it cover? This is the fun part. It covers like basically everyone. When it talks about persons in the statutes, they mean individuals, corporations, partnerships, organizations, their officers and directors, public officials, grocers, businesses, anyone. They want everyone to be in here. When they talk about nonprofits specifically, they're talking about not necessarily 501c3 nonprofits. So you don't have to be a registered and tax exempt organization to serve the nonprofit food distribution role under this statute and get protection. Really, it's an incorporated or unincorporated entity, could be a very loose community group with a religious, charitable, or educational purpose, and kind of feels nonprofit in character. You're not trying to benefit from this, you're trying to do good works. Also speaks about gleaners, so people or entities who harvest for donation an agricultural product that's grown by another. So those intermediaries doing the gleaning work in there are covered as well. What can you do? What kind of covered activities? The USDA has opined that field gleaning, perishable produce rescue and salvage, perishable and prepared food rescue, and non-perishable processed food collection are all the kinds of activities that are covered under this statute. Now, sometimes I refer to the Emerson Act as like an analog tool in a digital world. Like I said before, it was written and passed in 1996, and for those of you who have been doing this work at the time, or were doing the work at the time, doing it for a long time, you know that back then we were really talking more about moving those canned goods, the non-perishable sort of boxed rice-a-ronis and things, cereal that was coming close to date, etc., around, and not necessarily trying to get into the more challenging, more detail-intensive work of rescuing perishable and prepared food. But as we've come to realize that we really have a massive waste issue there, and we have people who need those health-promoting whole foods, we're trying to do that. The problem is it's a little more resource intensive. We need to move things under temperature control. The timing factor is real. You have to make sure you get the food where it needs to be pretty quickly. And so it can be a little more costly to run these programs now. People who work in the charitable food sector, people who are food waste fighters, have been enormously and inspiringly innovative, and they're coming up with all kinds of models to try to make this work feasible and to try to make the work cost effective. And some of those models involve skipping the intermediary and doing direct donation to needy people, setting up cost-reduced retail operations using food that has been gleaned or donated, such as the daily table, or doing at-cost sales when an organization collects a bunch of excess produce, for example, and preserves it. They need to recoup the costs of maybe the jars, the canning equipment, the energy and utilities used in processing that, and so they're just selling it at cost. Unfortunately, those kind of activities are not covered under the Emerson Act because they just weren't envisioned at the time. And so the Emerson Act really is limited to those purely donative through a charitable intermediary types of transactions. The other things it doesn't cover gross negligence. It doesn't cover intentional misconduct. And there's a really good reason for this. The reason, and that means gross negligence is like when you really knew or ought to know that what you were doing was going to harm the health or well-being of someone else. And then intentional misconduct is you did it on purpose. I feel like when I describe these things, though they're first-year law school concepts, they're also talking to your toddler concepts. So when we look at it, it's not always real clear what would qualify as wholesome food or what is and isn't sort of really on the line. But, and there's another challenge to this. There's been absolutely no interpretation of the Emerson Act since it was passed. My work started by trying to do a big national case law search to see what the level of risk really was with all of this food recovery and donation, figuring I'd find cases where there had been incidents and people had been sued and they held up the Emerson Act and defended themselves. The punchline to this story is that there were 0 such cases, and I rerun that search about every 6 months, and there are still 0 such cases. The Emerson Act has never been used or tested, and I can't find any litigation where people are suing each other over foodborne illness related to recovered and donated food. Never, not once. I've found some instances where there have been foodborne illness outbreaks related to charitable feeding organizations, donated food, and they all seem to resolve very, very amicably. The charitable feeding organization protects the donor. The health authorities make an inquiry, and in the cases that I've come across, they found that there were really good handling processes in place, and that, you know, something fell out of time or temperature because a volunteer maybe made a mistake, and there's been nothing further. But without that, so this is all really good news, right? This is not the kind of like American litigious situation that we might predict and fear. The bad news for the dorky lawyer in the room is that it doesn't give me a whole lot to dive into and to then help explain to you about how this works. So we have to look back at the legislative history, what our representatives were saying before they passed the bill, to figure out how they wanted it to work. And so they basically said, like, we're not going to set standards for this. It's case by case. We make a multi-factor inquiry. And they said that, you know, just because something is out of a freshness date or out of a code date on a box or container, that doesn't necessarily mean it's no longer wholesome. Which brings me to the point that some of you may have heard about already. The date labels that are on most of our food are not federally required, with the exception of infant formula. And the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic and the Natural Resources Defense Council put out a really great report on this a couple years back and have been doing great work on trying to get legislation passed to fix this crazy system we have of dates, because those dates make us feel uncomfortable. They make us feel like the food might not be safe. But most of those are just a manufacturer's idea of when a product is at peak freshness, peak texture, not when it's safe to consume. So in most states, it's perfectly okay, both legal and protected, to donate food that is out of date. Folks often ask me, well, why didn't Congress just eliminate all potential liability? Make this super simple, get rid of it all. But it's a balancing act, right? Because we want to make sure that we're protecting the vulnerable people who need to rely on charitable sources of food, making sure we're keeping a level of safety and vigilance in that food stream, and also trying to get people to recover more. So we don't want to say recover it all and forget about the people who need it. We don't want to say, oh, preserve all possible lawsuits and let it all go to waste. So there's an attempt to strike a balance there. There's a couple other things that the Emerson Act does that allows us to feel a little bit better about engaging in food recovery work. And the first is that it provides premises liability protection, exempting donors, and only donors, not the nonprofit folks, it's limited to the donors, from negligence liability associated with any accidents that occur while folks are gleaning or recovering food on their property. And that makes it easier for a farmer to say, yeah, sure, bring your team of volunteer gleaners here into my fields and let them pick what's left over, or to have a restaurant say, absolutely, your food recovery volunteers can come right into the kitchen and pick the stuff up right out of the walk-in and bring it to the car so that it's not sitting out. They don't have to worry about, you know, a slip and fall kind of accident, for example. There's also this idea that we can partially comply with those federal, state, and local quality and labeling laws by reconditioning food. So if you do have some food or grocery items that don't meet all of the standards that apply to them, they can still be donated, provided that you go through this reconditioning process of notifying the receiving nonprofit about the way in which the food doesn't conform. So these labels were printed wrong and they're missing the manufacturer's address, for example. That would be a technical deficiency. Or they don't have an allergen declaration, but they're free of all allergens. Or I can tell you that they contain dairy or eggs. And then the nonprofit knows how to recondition the food and agrees to do so. And there's a model consumer commodity salvage code that provides far more detail on that than most anybody wants to know, but I'm just pointing out that it exists. Okay, so this was intended to create a national standard, a minimum standard of protection. So it basically serves as the floor, not the ceiling. No state can provide less liability protection to those involved in food recovery and donation than the Bill Emerson Act does. But individual states can and do sometimes go further. Sometimes they've chosen to go further because they've amended their acts post-1996, and others just were already providing a more comprehensive level of protection, were allowing sort of substantial compliance with applicable health and safety regulations, or doing things like that. So it is and can be very valuable to take a look at your own state's Good Samaritan Acts and applicable laws. And this super dense slide of lawyer mumbo jumbo and links provides the state laws, the citations for all of the states in the Chesapeake watershed. So I am hoping that for those of you who want to hit the ground running and do this work, you'll be able to click through in here and just take a quick scan through what the code for your state says, and see if there's anything additional that you can feel good about and protected about. So how do we do this? What's the best way to get started? Like I said, read up a little more on the Bill Emerson Act. I published a Food Recovery, a legal guide that goes through all of it and describes it in sort of slower paced narrative detail. And the PDF is actually embedded in these slides and linked. Then go ahead and check those state level Good Samaritan laws and see what the state of play is in the state or states that you're likely to be operating in or donating in. And if you're really doing some hyper-local food system work, you're within one state, it can be really beneficial if your state is making it even more, even easier, facilitating it even more. Then developed a productive and proactive relationship with your local regulators and inspectors. I've done this work in several states now. I have tried to guide and support some large organizations establishing corporate food recovery programs in across state lines. And what we found time after time after time is that you're better off not trying to like get away with something, hide something, do something under the radar, even if it's a really good, charitable, well-intentioned, gracious thing. Instead, having a conversation with the folks who regulate and inspect you about what you're trying to do and making sure that you're sort of doing some mutual education. Here's this food waste problem. Here's this hunger problem. Here's this opportunity. Here's how we're handling the food. These are the regulations we imagine might apply. How can you help us make sure we're doing this in a way that is really safe? It's not a required step. You're certainly legally allowed and protected to do it without that, but it can make things go a whole lot smoother. Also, the FDA and the USDA have empowered a body called the Conference for Food Protection to write what used to be called the Comprehensive Guidelines for Food Recovery and are being revised as the Comprehensive Recommendations for Food Recovery. They were last updated in 2007, and they are either like about to come out with the new ones or still finalizing them. But several folks, myself included, have been involved in the effort to get them to make them a little more streamlined, simple, easier to implement for food recovery groups on the ground. And then do some detailed planning with partners and training of your own staff and volunteers. When I work on making a food recovery plan, what I try to do first is assess the excess food streams that a particular source has and think about their potential next uses. So is it that we have excess produce because, you know, we're keeping those store shelves really well stocked? If they're not really well stocked, no one takes that last bunch of kale. You know, if there's just one left, they don't take it because something must be wrong with it. So we're keeping everything really bountifully stocked, and now we have this excess fresh food. Or are we dealing with a school system and all kinds of extra little tiny cartons of milk at the end of the day and, you know, prepackaged Nutri-Grain bars? Are we dealing with shelf-stable food? Are we dealing with a lot of post-consumer plate waste that can't be reserved to humans but could potentially go to livestock or be composted? Look at what kind of food stream or streams you have. Think about what anticipated quantities of excess food you're generating. And while you're doing that sort of qualitative and quantitative analysis, you know, actually gather a little bit of data, do some weighing. I often talk about how when we started doing this at the University of Arkansas, our food service provider was, you know, kind of like tentatively on board with what we were doing. And as a show of good faith, offered to buy us a refrigerator to collect and hold the food until we could distribute it. It was really nice of them. They bought us this tiny apartment-sized domestic refrigerator. And within the first week, we were losing food because it was so full we couldn't cool it all down. That turned into an opportunity for them. They could see where they actually had an opportunity to reduce at the source, to change some of their stocking patterns, to discount food later in the day, and to make sure they were generating less waste. So it can be a really good systems analysis tool anyway. So once you determine what you've got, take a look at what's fit for donation and find those other opportunities to conserve unwholesome excess. Then identify your key players. Who are your possible partner organizations? Do you have charitable food distribution partners in your community that you can easily get the type of food you have to? And can those distribution partners get that food out in a timely way? Do they have the capacity to take all that extra produce and turn it into soup? Do they have food pantry pickups where they can get that milk out into the hands of people who need it right away? Or are they running a meal only once a month and they're not in a great position to move food that quickly? So you want to optimize the synergies between the types of food to be donated and the needs and the capacities of the donee organizations. Then you want to really outline some proposed terms of the relationship between the donor food business and the distribution organization. And if you're working with more than one donee organization, it's helpful to think through how you're going to allocate and prioritize donations, because the folks who are, in this partnership with you are going to come to expect and rely on those sources of charitable food. And so you don't want to get into a competitive situation or one where you're developing tensions. Next, it's helpful to develop protocol for segregating food, for handling food, for keeping records about how it is, held at time and temperature, and then for taking those protocols and training your staff or volunteers on them. Those comprehensive recommendations have great best management practices for food safety and defense. Your local regulators might also have good materials for you on this. I know up here in Vermont, I worked with the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Health to develop a set of those best management practices that we can now just hand to anybody who is interested in doing that work. And then you also want to design efficiency and contingency strategies. Who are you communicating with if, there actually isn't any excess food to pick up today? What do you do if there's nobody at the drop-off location? Make sure you know what you're doing so that you're not constantly in this state of organizational pins and needles about pulling it off. Obtain proper equipment. Sometimes there's not a whole lot of equipment that's needed at all, other than maybe some dedicated reusable food storage containers, because you don't want to make more waste with the packaging if you can help it. Sometimes when you take a clear-eyed look at a situation, you find that you have a grocery store and a charitable dinner site, a soup kitchen site, in the same shopping center in the same town, and you can literally take the grocery carts and push the food across the parking lot to get it there. And I worked on a project where that was the solution. Sometimes it's trickier and you're trying to get clear across Baltimore at rush hour, and so having some temperature control equipment, even if it's insulated coolers and freeze packs, and having transportation can make all the difference in the world. And that's where some of the resources and fundraising may need to come in. And then establish a neutral means of addressing any unsatisfactory interactions or raising concerns. If the recipient organization finds that the food has been improperly handled, if either party sees that there's been a breach of protocol, or if the food that's coming starts to feel like it's of poor quality, or if it's unsuitable, if the charitable feeding organization has implemented, for example, nutritional standards for their food, which is a great thing that so many are moving towards, and the donated food is consistently falling outside of those standards. You want to have some sort of system set up for, who's going to talk these things out? How are we going to make this a really mutually beneficial exchange? Because one of the things we really don't want to see happening is grocers, food retailers, generators of excess wholesome food, but maybe not optimal food, not the kind of food that the organization wants to distribute or has capacity to distribute, sort of just offloading their tipping fees, offloading their trash removal work onto a thinly resourced charity. So make a plan, train, implement, and then this should also say refine. Okay, just checking time really quick. Couple other legal dimensions that I am not going to go into in depth today, but that I've written about at length in other places, that the Food Recovery Project, sometimes on our own, sometimes with the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, have done a lot of work on, and we have guidance on our websites. The other dimensions are that you do have state, county, and local laws and regulations that may, in some kind of narrow cases, address the types of food that may be recovered, address specific handling, labeling, or disclosure requirements when donating food that might actually be separate from all of the ways in which you handle food for sale. I tend to think that this is a whole lot of nonsense when it happens, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So I often, when talking to regulators, will say, tell me what's the difference between the last student that goes through that line at the dining hall and takes the Cheerios out of the Lucite container and serves himself, and the first person who gets them bagged up at the food pantry. Why are we requiring different handling? It's not often that there's substantial differences, but there can be, and that's where having that open dialogue with your regulators can make a big difference. If you're trying to take the inedible stuff and put it towards animal feed, make sure you're aware of the laws and regulations pertaining to use of leftovers or excess food for livestock feed. And along with the Harvard team, I co-authored a guide, a 50-state survey guide to laws and regulations pertaining to this subject called Leftovers for Livestock, which you can find if you're interested in engaging in that work. And that looks at the federal and the state dimensions there. There's also the tax code and the federal enhanced tax deduction for food donations, which is in section 170E3C of the Internal Revenue Code. It is now permanent. This is something that should be changed, something that happened in the last year, and we've also written a guide about that. There may also be state tax incentives. I am almost certain New York has a state tax incentive for food donation. We haven't gotten to do the 50-state work on that just yet. And then understanding whether there are state or local organic waste bans, limits, incentives for this sort of thing. Here in Vermont, we are moving to a full organic waste ban to be completely implemented by 2020. So all of our organizations are trying to figure out, how we move this excess around efficiently with limited resources before that goes into effect. I think I've touched now, just kind of as I was going along, on some of the shortcomings of the Emerson Act. When I first started doing this kind of legal education, I would tell people, like, this is great and it is going to solve all your problems. And then they kept getting more innovative, and I kept realizing that, like, ooh, you don't quite fit in the middle of what they're trying to cover. But it does cover a whole lot of activity. It covers a lot. It covers all of the donative stuff. It even allows multiple nonprofits to handle the food. So the food can go from a restaurant or grocer or dining hall to a food bank. As between the food bank and the charitable food provider, a nominal fee can change hands to cover the costs, but you can't charge the end user anything. So those cost-reduced retail models don't work. As I said, there's been no case law, there's no judicial interpretation, there's really almost no regulatory interpretation because the statute didn't assign a federal agency to implement the law or to raise awareness and educate about it. The USDA has at times picked up that responsibility, but they're doing that just because they're really trying to make progress on food waste. The EPA has done that as well, although more on the side of educating about food waste, less on this particular statute. But those folks have been really great about trying to move this forward during the Obama administration, and it's been a real privilege to work with some of them. As I mentioned, you can't donate directly to needy individuals. So if you have a bakery and you've got leftover bagels at the end of the day and you see a family in need come in and you want to just like give them some extra, you can do that. It's not illegal to do that, but you're not going to get the benefit of the liability protection. The donability of past date foods and so both the donability, whether you can actually legally donate it and whether you're covered for liability protection. Like I said, it's clear from the legislative history only at the federal level, and I'm pretty comfortable with the legislative history at the federal level. However, some states do say that they regulate dates on certain foods, and this is where that Harvard report is really useful in figuring out what happens in your state. They regulate those dates, and a few of those states actually say you cannot sell and you cannot donate after that date. So that's an important thing to know if you're in those states. And, you know, reconditioning shouldn't necessarily be required if the labeling deficiency is not safety related, but from the straight text of the Emerson Act, those minor defects where, like, we all know what's inside, and it's really only the fact that this has the wrong name on it, that has to be addressed under the Act. So the last couple moments that I speak at you before I take your questions, I just want to go back to that that phrase I introduced earlier, and talk about moving towards an ethos of food conservation, developing and advocating for policies that will define a body of law to help us promote the careful and complete use of our food resources and all the resources in them. You've probably seen the EPA's food recovery hierarchy that starts with source reduction and then says donate to people, feed animals, compost, AD, and then industrial uses, and then sort of like then the landfill. I don't love hierarchies, but I made one of my own. And I think the first thing we need to do is make a big food culture shift towards valuing food, mainstreaming new food sources, getting real about our expectations of how much food, diversity of food ought to be available to us everywhere we go. Getting creative about using leftovers or things that are maybe a little past their prime, and being willing to pay closer to the full costs of food. We then have to get involved in that source reduction, all of us at home and at work. And then we need to think about sharing with people. And I really, really prefer, you know, the statute makes me say donate, but I prefer to think about it as sharing, and thinking about not only what we do through the charitable food system, through donations to food insecure people, but how we create opportunities for people to buy food in a really dignified way that that fits within the parameters of limited budgets, how we repurpose food, how we invest in the physical and policy-related infrastructures for sharing, and how we also just share among our friends. Coworkers and I have started doing things like one of us will bake all the bread at the beginning of the week and someone else is making cheese. And yes, I live in a very idyllic little agrarian place, but these things can be replicated, right, in more urban and suburban communities where we're actually sharing food, sharing the energy that it takes to make that food. And that allows allows us the opportunity to use our food before it's past its prime, before it can't be consumed. And then feed the system. It's not, in my mind, always better to feed animals and then feed the soil next and then go to AD. You really have to look at the dynamics of the area you're at. Is there a closer place to compost than there is to, you know, create pig feed? Can you compost it in your backyard? Do you have animals? Are you in a really rural place where actually it makes the most sense to compost most of what you've got, because you'd be driving the excess food for miles and miles and miles to try to get it to a human in need, and adding all kinds of extra resources that you're wasting in the process. So really thinking about feeding the food system itself, and building that value, putting those resources back in the system. And if you wind up with something you can't do any of the above with, well, analyze it and figure out why it wasn't captured above. And well, maybe that'll have to go in the trash, but next time you'll do better. And so with that, let's see, what do I have next? That's me. This slide is a little harder to read than I had hoped, but my contact information is on there, and I'll fix it so it's easier to read. Information about the programs I work in, links to places where you can find all the documents I've talked about, and the LLM program, which trains lawyers to do the kind of work that you've just seen me do today. It's really important work, it's really impactful work, and it's a way for folks who want to either take their existing JD and legal expertise and turn it into food system advocacy skill set, or for new folks who are maybe thinking about being a lawyer but don't know exactly how they'd want to practice, to come up with a really impactful path forward through life in the law. And with that, I am going to come out of full screen here, and there you go.
Great, Nicole, that was so fantastic. Thank you so much for, I mean, wow, chock full of so much information, everything that could everything to ground us in the Emerson Act, but also giving us links to specific regulations within each one of the states, and then the plan for recovering food. I mean, really very helpful and well thought out. So thank you so much for that. We will, just so everyone knows, we will share a link to the webinar recording so that you can revisit the actual recording, and we will also share a PDF of the slides. But we did receive a number of great questions, Nicole, for the, got about 5 or 7 minutes for questions.
Sure.
And if we don't get to all the questions, we will share the questions with Nicole and follow up with all of the folks that have registered after the webinar. The first question, though, is around the 501c3 status, and what type of recipient organization is required so that the donor is protected by the Bill Emerson Act? I know the Act requires a nonprofit organization. Is there an official definition or certification required? If the recipient organization is not a 501c3 or does not match the definition of a nonprofit, does the liability fall on the back of the donor?
Great question. And there's 2 separate questions in there. The first is really, how does the Emerson Act itself define nonprofit? And I started to go through this in my slides pretty quickly, but it does not mention 501c3s. And I'm actually trying to pull up the definition itself while I'm looking right here. The Act itself says that a nonprofit organization means an incorporated or unincorporated entity that is operating for religious, charitable, or educational purposes and does not provide net earnings to or operate in any other manner that inures to the benefit of any officer, employee, or shareholder of the entity. So there's not that personal profit piece, the individual profit piece. There's no shareholders who are profiting, but you don't have to be a licensed a registered 501c3. I will note that that's a difference between the Emerson Act and the tax incentive. If you as a donor want to be able to claim the federal enhanced tax deduction for food donation and get sort of that double benefit for donating food and how you deduct and are able to calculate the deduction, you do have to donate to a 501c3. So there's a mismatch in how those 2 laws are written. They make it really easy. So, and then the question of, if as a donor you donate to someone who doesn't necessarily fall into the right definition, doesn't satisfy the Emerson Act definition of a nonprofit does that potentially vitiate your protection? And this is where the fact that we have no case law makes it really hard. And so you'd want a good attorney to step up and say, like, hey, listen, they had a good faith belief that this was a nonprofit organization. All of the information that the donor had showed that they were a nonprofit organization. I guess if I were providing advice, what I would say to a business is, if you're dealing with someone who's the receiving agency, the receiving organization that's not a 501c3, you'd want to get in writing a statement from them that they are organized in a way that satisfies this definition in the statute. And by doing that, you'd have some good cover. But again, since we have no interpretive guidance here, it's hard to give you like a, super solid answer to that question.
Thanks, Nicole. And just sort of leading off of that, and maybe you've already answered it, but just to make sure, somebody asked whether or not they understood that when the donation is, that the Act, what they want to know is how does the Act work when the donation is made to a nonprofit, but then they pass it on to a site that is not a nonprofit, but is serving low-income children? So I guess the question is really interested in the donor. Would they still be covered by the Act if the food were donated to it originally got donated to a nonprofit and then were donated to some other group that was not a nonprofit?
It would depend on what that third group did with the food. So if it went from donor, let's call it a grocery store, to a nonprofit food distribution center that gave it to a third party that wasn't a nonprofit but ultimately didn't charge the recipients.
Yes, they're saying low-income children, a group serving low-income children.
Yeah. So if we're not charging the low-income children for the food, then I feel really comfortable that it's covered, because the concern is really about the ultimate recipient. So the donor has done, their due diligence in making sure they're donating to a nonprofit, and the food is ultimately being provided free of charge. I feel like we're certainly within the spirit of the Emerson Act, and very, very close, if not completely within its letter. So I think I'm comfortable with that. If the third party, that ultimate food provider, was charging, then it wouldn't work.
Okay, thank you. There was a question from Aisha Salazar about, there was an article about new food pantries popping up in neighborhoods or outside churches or businesses, similar to the little free libraries. Are those covered? And then she provided a link to the article, which we can share later. But
yeah, so I've read a lot about those, and that's one of those things where, like, man, we're getting good at creative solutions, and I'm not sure the law has really caught up to it. It's a challenging one for a couple of reasons. One, it would have to do with how it's structured and how's the food getting there, right? Like, are the donors just putting it in? Is there an organization maintaining those boxes? Or does this feel more like that direct donation to an individual? The other reason I think it might get tricky is that, depending on how that's set up, it can be very hard to track and to prove that you're holding food at time and temperature correctly, that and to have that, like, sort of evidentiary trail of compliance with all of those other handling related regulations. So it would really depend on the type of food and the structure of the operation in terms of how this would apply. It's something that has definitely come up as those of us who do this work are thinking about, the deficiencies, the shortcomings of the Emerson Act, and what we would like to see in terms of reforms to make it more responsive to these really community-oriented, direct impact solutions that are coming up.
Great. And we only have 3 minutes left, but I did just want to ask you one more question here.
Sure.
And again, we'll follow up with the other ones that we were not able to cover today and share those with you, Nicole. But this is kind of a specific one. If apple growers are not allowed to sell apples that touch the ground, would they be protected if they allowed gleaners to glean those dropped apples?
That's a tough one. And I think that one varies state by state, because I've definitely looked at it here in Vermont, and I'm like blanking on where I decided. I created a policy for our own apples on our campus here, and we can't process drops because we serve the cider raw. And I think that state by state, the way drops are handled really is a matter of local regulation. I haven't seen anything on there. There's nothing on the federal level necessarily about drops. So you would have to see about whether you could serve drops, and whether there's a difference between clean drops or ones that have open blemishes, cuts, bruises, and then again, whether those drops are being used for fresh consumption, for raw cider, or for pasteurized cider, or something processed like applesauce. So there's a lot of dynamics to that one that I'm not going to be able to figure out, unfortunately, in 30 seconds.
Yeah, sorry.
But it's a really good question, and it actually really highlights, what can be the complexity around some of these things, which brings me right back to that, like, have a really good relationship with your regulator. And if more people in your area are having those conversations with county regulators, like, I've seen the email threads, the regulators start to talk to each other. They start to realize, like, oh, this is something we're going to have to create a task force for. More people are trying to figure this out, and they slowly get on board. But it's definitely a little bit of a culture shift within those regulatory agencies that's been happening.
Thank you, Nicole. I really appreciate that. And again, appreciate the wonderful, really dense and rich presentation that you've shared today. This webinar was brought to you by the Food Waste Recovery Work Group, and Nancy Nunn is the co-chair for the Food Waste and Recovery Work Group, and she's going to walk you through some potential next steps.
Well, thanks, Christy. And Nicole, thank you so much. I know this group is really interested in this topic, and we've wanted to have a webinar on it for a long while. So I think we have a lot to think about. The next steps focus a lot on, well, first of all, I wanted to also acknowledge Jill Jefferson, who's on the phone call and is the co-chair of the Foodshed Waste Recovery Group, and was really at one of the first meetings suggested this as a topic for one of the work groups. If you look at very quickly the next steps, we will be having our quarterly work group meeting in February. So if you do have agenda items, if there's something that you think about as a result of this conversation later this week, please let Yona know, and we'd certainly like to put it on the agenda or consider it for a future webinar. I'm sure many of you are going to Future Harvest CASA's conference, which started today with pre-conference events, but there are several sessions in that conference on waste recovery. So be sure to look that up. And then the third thing is that Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future is planning a food waste and recovery workshop this summer with Harvard Law School. So we are just waiting to get some more specifics about that event, and we will certainly get it out to everyone. But again, Nicole, thanks so much for bringing all of your knowledge to us.
And Nancy, just real quick, that Food Waste Recovery Work Group meeting, it's open to anyone, right? Anyone can join?
Absolutely. The more the merrier.
All right, Nicole, sorry for interrupting you, but thank you very much again for being here with us today. So appreciate your time and all the great work that you are doing. And thank you all for attending. Here is a list of some of our upcoming webinars. You can find out more about the webinars that the Chesapeake Foodshed Network is offering by going to our website, chesapeakefoodshed.net. And thank you all for your time today and for being here with us. Great to have you.
Thank you.